Life as a convict on a prison ship was brutal. Squalid and overcrowded conditions, inadequate food and punishment for ill behaviour were bad enough, but being aboard these hulks, as they were called, was only half the story of misery awaiting a man condemned to be interred on these decommissioned old warships on the River Thames. Punishment, if your body could take it, was hard labour as well. Convicts were initially put to work improving the Thames navigation for London's ships, ballast heaving or building walls. But because hulks were moored in dockyards, the government soon found use for prisoners as cheap labour in the public service for the ever-expanding military complex known as the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich. Hundreds of men, both common working-class labourers and convicts, worked at Woolwich Arsenal. The site was a huge centre for armament design and manufacture. Men toiled in sawmills to provide wood for gun carriages, in shot and shell factories, in construction works, or at the gruelling task of breaking stone. In the 1860s, Henry Mayhew, a Victorian journalist, documented the workings of the criminal prisons of London. He visited the prisons to investigate prison life for himself and interviewed officers and wardens. Mayhew visited the prison hulk Defence, which was moored at Woolwich on the River Thames. She was a third-rate ship of the line of the Royal Navy, in service from 1815 until converted to a prison ship in 1849. Mayhew's visit must have taken place before the 14th of July 1857, which is the date on which he was badly damaged by accidental fire and scuttled. You can find out more about the story of life on ship in these floating hells in my video on prison hulks, link in the description, telling how dangerous and deadly they were in the early 1800s. Today, we accompany Mayhew as he leaves the Defence hulk with the Deputy Governor and his officers to view the convicts at work in the arsenal. Find out what strict military-like regime and hard labour the prisoners faced, how men tried to escape, and sometimes succeeded, by secreting clothes for disguise on their person and crawling through drains out of the marshes. Discover how they were continually watched over by armed guards, said to be cruel, but they were strict because they were under severe orders themselves, and fined money if a convict under their watch was found slacking, and the escape of a prisoner resulted in his immediate dismissal. But it wasn't only the guards that continually watched the prisoners in their back-breaking work. They were forever haunted by the view of the convicts' burial ground, a fate that awaited any man whose body gave in to disease, exhaustion, or a bullet received attempting escape. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. 9 bells, 7 o'clock, sounded as we went once more below and found that the men had just finished cleaning their tin mugs and were gathering up the bits of chalk into bags and arranging these same mugs on top of the inverted plates round their tables ready for dinner. Some, too, were washing the tables again to get beforehand with their work, while others were covering their bright tin plates and mugs with the coarse tablecloths to keep the dirt from them, and others again were reading their Bibles or lounging lazily about. They know to a minute the time they have, sir, and the officers are as severely taught to obey the progress of the clock, for if they are not at the landing steps at 7 precisely, the boat pushes off without them and will not return to fetch them. The boat that had gone to bring the warders aboard was soon on its way back to the ship, crowded with the glazed caps and dark uniforms of the officers, relieved by the fresh white guernseys of the convict rowers. 7 o'clock is the hour for the officers' parade upon the quarter-deck, the object being to see that they are sober and fit for duty. The parade over, the guard appears on deck. It consists of 4 men, armed with carbines, and with their cartouche boxes slung behind them by a broad black belt. The guard stands near the gangway, the men having their carbines loaded and held ready to fire while the prisoners pass to the boats. Looking overboard, we now perceive the convict boatmen in their guernseys and glazed hats, bringing the 2 longboats to their proper position opposite the gangway, ready for the debarkation of the prisoners on their way to their work at the arsenal. At 7:15 the officers for duty ashore are called over by the chief warder in the presence of the deputy governor, while a principal checks them. 12 extra guards, composed chiefly of soldiers from the Crimea, and some wearing clasps upon their warder's uniform. A uniform, by the way, exactly resembling that of the Pentonville officers. Now file down the steps, to be ready to receive the prisoners, who begin to appear above the hatchways, marching in single file towards the gangway with a heavy and rapid tread, and it is an exciting sight to see the never-ending line of convicts stream across the deck and down the gangway, the steps rattling as they descend one after another into the capacious boat, amid the cries of the officer at the ship's side. "Come, look sharp there! Men, look sharp!" The rowers hold their oars raised in the air as the brown-uniformed line of men flows rapidly into the cutter below. Some seat themselves in the stern, but the large majority stand in a dense mass in the bottom of the long, low craft, dotted here and there by the dark dress of the officers planted in the midst of them. In fine weather, no less than 110 convicts are landed in each of these boats or cutters. It is pretty to watch these long boats glide slowly to the pier, their dense human freight painted brown on the stream, and scarcely has one boat landed its felon crew before another is filled, and making for the arsenal pier and the shore. Nor is it less picturesque to see the prisoners clamber up to the parade ground, fall in line there with military precision, separate according to the chief officer's directions into working parties, each working party being in charge of a warder, and move off to the scene of their day's labour in long brown strings. This is a very curious scene, and one that it will be impossible to witness some few years hence. A third or surplus small cutter puts off with the few remaining prisoners and more guards. These guards, we observe, wear cutlasses, such cutlasses being carried as a special protection, for the officers wearing them have charge of working parties employed beyond the bounds of the arsenal, as, for instance, upon a mortar battery in the marshes. The men are now off to work. Those prisoners who remain in the ship are in the deck cabins, plying their handicraft for the use of the hulk. We now left the hulk in the deputy governor's gig, in company with that officer who acted himself as a steersman. "Now then, shove off, all together, lay on your oars, sharp as you can," were the brisk orders as we neared the shore. The directions to the men ran, "Hold water, all of you, pull all, hard a starboard, port, there, ship oars." The men obeyed these nautical directions with admirable precision, and soon landed us at the arsenal stairs, amid huge stone heaps, piles of cannon tumbled about, and all bounded by long storehouses and workshops that seemed to cross each other in every direction. We accompanied the deputy governor in his inspection of the gangs, as the convict crews stood drawn up in lines, headed by their respective officers. It is necessary to change and equalize the gangs daily, we were told, according to the work each has to perform. Here the officers proceeded to search under the men's waistcoats and examine their neckcloths so as to prevent the secretion of clothes about their persons, which would enable them to disguise themselves and to escape among the free labourers. No less than 17 such attempts to escape had taken place among the defence convicts in 1 year, though out of these only 3 got off. In 1854 there were 5 attempts at escape, of which but 1 was successful. The searching and arrangement of the working parties or gangs being effected, the officer gives the word of command. "Cover," then "Pace forward," and each gang wheels off to the direction of its work, the men walking 2 abreast, and the rear being brought up by the officer in charge. As the several gangs leave the parade ground, the officer in charge gives the number of his party and that of his men. The parties, or gangs, are numbered from 1 to 30. Thus, as one party passes, the officer calls 2-8. That is, party number 2, containing 8 men. Close up your party, Matthews, they're all straggling," cries the deputy governor to one of the guards who was taking off his men somewhat carelessly. The arsenal is now in full activity. The tall chimneys vomit dense clouds of black smoke. Steam spurts up here and there. The sharp click of hammers falling upon metal can be heard on all sides. The men are beginning to roll the shells along the miniature railways laid along the ground for the purpose. All the gangs of prisoners are off, leaving a dense cloud of dust behind them. There are 299 in the arsenal today, the Deputy Governor informs us. The number is added, he says, to the ascertained number remaining on board the hulk, and then, if the whole tally with the number registered upon the Governor's books, all is right. We then turned our attention to the hulk once more and re-enter the Deputy Governor's gig, as we were jerked through the water by the regular strokes of the men and the measured working of the rowlocks. We noticed the heavy cranes planted along the quay, their wheels covered with small roofs like parasols, but bearing, nevertheless, some evidences of exposure to the weather. "With one of those cranes," said the officer to us, "I have seen a single man lift a cannon on board a ship. They are worked by hydraulic pressure." No sooner did we reach the gangway of the defence once more than the principal warder on board cried, as he met the Deputy Governor, 299, sir," alluding to the number of prisoners who had left the ship for labour in the arsenals. "All right," was the laconic reply. The prisoners left aboard the hulk were now busy washing the deck and the gangway. Some dashed buckets of water on the boards, while others were vigorously plying flat scrubbing brushes fixed at the extremity of long handles. Below, in a boat alongside the hulk, were more brown-uniformed prisoners, pumping at a small engine and forcing the water taken from the artesian well into the arsenal, into the capacious tanks of the hulk. There is, in fact, one continued splashing of liquid everywhere, on the decks and in the longboats or cutters, which have now returned from the shore. The defence, we may add, has 20 tanks, holding 2 tons each of water. We now passed to the little rooms off the wards, where a few prisoners were tailoring, while others were making the solid shoes such as the working gangs in the arsenal wear. We then advanced to the cabins ranged along the sides of the weather deck. In one a bookbinder was binding the library volumes in black leather. "Take off your cap, sir," cried our attendant to the prisoner, as we appeared, "and go on with your work." Next we passed to the lampman's cabin, and found him trimming the night lamps for the wards. Then we reached the carpenter's shop, and there a grey-headed old prisoner who was planing a deal board turned a melancholy face towards us as we entered. Then we visited the linen house, where 2 or 3 prisoners were arranging the linen of the various wards in little tight rolls. We inquired how often the men had a change. "They changed their linen every week, and their flannels every fortnight," was the reply. How gratifying to men who can remember the horrible filth in which, only a few years since, the hulk convicts were allowed to remain. There was not an idle man on board. Festoons of clothes were drying above our heads, swung from the 2 stunted masts, while across the main deck lines of dark brown string were being twisted by a convict rope-maker, to be turned to account for the hammocks that 2 other prisoners were mending in a little cabin hard by. Everywhere officers were standing over the men at their labours, each warder being provided with his book, in which he enters the men's industry or want of energy. Their tone to the men was firm, but not hard or harsh. They still kept them to their task. Every prisoner we approached saluted us, military fashion, then stood still till the officer said, "Go on with your work, sir. Go on with your work," when the men turned to their labour again. The governor now called his gig to the gangway to carry us ashore to inspect the labourers in the arsenal. It was a smart little boat, and the rowers were trimly dressed in white, with the word "Defence" printed round the legs of their trousers. The men, with their glazed hats and ruddy faces, looked on like convicts. Their position is the reward of good conduct. They sit in a little deck-house close to the gangway, all day long, ready to be called out at any moment. The men volunteer for boat service. First, they are put into the water boat, which conveys the well water to and from the shore. From this service they are promoted to the provision cutter, which also takes off the subordinate officers. And then they reach a seat in the governor's gig. The men like this service, and are sent for misconduct, as when they use bad language, to labour on the public works. We started for the arsenal once more, at a rapid pace, the governor himself steering the pretty gig with its white tiller ropes. On landing, after passing the heavy cranes, we came up with the first gang of prisoners who were loading a bark alongside the quay. "These are the sloops that convey war stores to Sheerness," we were told, "and yonder black hull is a floating powder magazine, near which no ship anchors." We remarked the absence of military sentries, and were told that they had been withdrawn from the convicts working in the arsenal, although they still mounted guard. Then the places pointed out to us where the defence once had a washing house, which had been taken away by the government, together with a vegetable garden where the convicts formerly cultivated vegetables for the hulk. "Now we wash on board the little sulphur hulk, and dry on board our own ship," continued our informant. We walked into the grounds of the arsenal, and soon came up with a second party of prisoners at work digging out shot. As we approached, the officer in charge gave the governor a military salute, saying, "All right, sir, 10-8, the 10 being, as we have already noticed, the number of the gang, and 8 the strength of it. The governor, who knows what the strength of each gang is, can thus assure himself of the presence of all of the men. We next turned into the stone yard, the chosen ground of hard, dull, mechanical labour. Here there was a strong gang of men breaking granite. "All right, how many?" calls the governor. "All right, sir, 8-9, answers the officer in charge. Then seeing a free workman at hand, the officer is told to keep him off. Here each man is doing task work. Every convict must break so many bushels, according to the size to which he is required to reduce them, the size being measured by a wooden machine through which they are passed. Thus, a man breaking up the stone small for a garden walk must break 2 bushels daily, whereas a man breaking them up less must fill 4 or 6 bushel measures. We then passed on to huge stacks of valuable timber. "All this," said our companion, "has been piled by convict labour, through fields of cannon lying in rows, here black as charcoal, there red with rust, past stacks of wheels and wheelless wagons, by sheds where the air was impregnated with turpentine from the freshly worked timber, under heavy cranes, through mud and sawdust and shavings. Here hailing a gang turning a wheel, and there a gang clearing rubbish. Deep down a grove of conical heaps of rusty shells, where the men were filing and polishing them, we made our round of the convict working parties. All of them were busy. The officer takes care of that, for he is fined 1 shilling every time one of his men is caught idling, while the escape of one entails his dismissal. Suddenly we came upon a guard whose duty it was to go the round of the gangs and collect the men who wished to satisfy a call of nature. Then we came upon an angle of the arsenal wall against the Plumstead High Road, where we saw an armed guard with his carbine marching rapidly backward and forward. "Now I shall know directly whether all is right," said the governor as he raised his hand. The sentinel instantly halted, presented arms, then raised his right hand. "Had there been an escape," continued the governor, "he would have grasped his carbine by the barrel and held it aloft horizontally. That is the escape signal, and this man is stationed here because escape would be easy over the wall to the high road. Only the other day I caused a drain to be stopped up that led from the arsenal to the marshes. For we once had a hunt that lasted all day long after 2 prisoners who got into that drain. We caught them at its mouth by the Plumstead Road. It is exceedingly difficult to prevent attempts at escape, especially while there are so many free men in the arsenal. Last year there were no less than 14,000 free labourers employed there, and these men taken on without reference to character. Here the attempts at escape which prisoners had made from time to time formed for some time the subject of our conversation. The convicts, we were told, were generally assisted by the free labourers, who deposited clothes for them in some convenient spot. The convict slipped for a moment from his gang, put the clothes on, and passed out of the arsenal gates with the crowds of free men, or else he made a dash for it, bolted past the sentinels, swam the canal, reached the marshes, and made off to the wood at hand. These attempts sometimes defied the utmost vigilance of the officers. It was the duty of a guard, from whose gang a man escaped, to hasten on board with the rest of his men, unless he can find an officer to undertake this duty while he runs after the lost man, and report the escape. Then the police authorities are signalled by telegraph to Bow Street, Erith, Guildford, Ilford, Bexley Heath, and Shooter's Hill, so as to surround him with a band of vigilant policemen and prevent his getting clear. It was impossible to guard entirely against these attempts under this mixed system. They could not prevent the men from talking by night. But how much worse was it under the old system, when some 600 or 700 prisoners were crammed into a hulk smaller than the defence, and with only one officer all night to watch them? We inquired whether the men were very severely punished when they were lazy, and were answered in the affirmative. "They are sent here to labour," said the governor. "Here, officer, give me your labour book." This book contained on one side a description of the nature and quantity of the work performed, and on the other the conduct of the men during the work. We were assured, however, that the men have very seldom to be punished for idleness. "They do twice as much as free men," added the governor. "They work excellently." We now turned from the busy arsenal, crossed the canal bridge, and approached the little black wooden lodge of the policeman who guards the gate leading to the marshes. He salutes us as we pass out to the marshes. The scene, close by the gate, is singularly English. To the right lies the rising ground of Plumstead, with its red square church tower peeping from among the dense green cluster of the trees. Below is a cluster of village houses, and beyond swells Abbey Wood up the shelving ground, while beyond this, again, and serving as background, rises Shooter's Hill, capped by 2 or 3 suburban villas. Right before us is a vast earthwork, all, as we are told, raised by convict labour. It is a 6-mortar battery. We approached it, crossing the range where the ordnance authorities try their rifles at the butt, while the solitary man, far over the marshes, comes out of the shed by the side of the mark, after every shot, and with a long pole marks the point hit, and found the prisoners, with their brown jackets thrown off, and some with their legs buried in water boots, reaching to their thighs, digging the heavy, black, clayey soil, and carrying it away in barrows, under the eyes of 2 guards, with their cutlasses at their sides, and 2 non-commissioned officers of the sappers and miners, who were directing the works. "That's a nice circular cut, sir," said one of the non-commissioned officers, pointing to the earthwork thrown up. The governor then challenged the guards, who told off their numbers and gave the usual "all right." The bright red shell jackets and the caps with gay gold bands stood out in painful contrast with the dingy crew of unfortunate men they were directing. As we looked on at the work going bravely forward, our attention was specially directed to the healthy appearance of the men. "See," said the governor, evidently not a little proud of their ruddy cheeks. "They are not ill-looking men. I have to punish them very seldom. 1 or 2 of the men in the stone yard were old offenders, and they're the best behaved. That's a fine young chap there, stripped to the buff, and working away hard." We turned away, and went farther over the marshes, the ground giving way under our feet, and presently we passed behind the butt, while the Minier balls were whistling through the air. Hollow-based bullets invented in 1847 that came to prominence during the Crimean War. And that solitary man was marking the hits. We approached a low piece of ground, in no way marked off from the rest of the marsh, in no way distinguishable from any section of the dreary expanse, save that the long rank grass had been turned in one place lately, and that there was an upset barrow lying not far off. Heavy leaden clouds were rolling overhead, and some heavy drops of rain pattered upon our faces as we stood there. We thought it was one of the dreariest spots we had ever seen. "This," said the governor, "is the convicts' burial ground." We could just trace the rough outline of disturbed ground at our feet. Beyond this was a shed, where cattle found shelter in bad weather, and to the right the land shelved up between the marsh and the river. There was not even a number over the graves. The last, and it was only a month old, was disappearing. In a few months the rank grass will have closed over it, as over the story of its inmate, and it is perhaps well to leave the names of the unfortunate men whose bones lie in the clay of this dreary marsh, unregistered and unknown. But the feeling with which we look upon its desolation is irrepressible. We followed the governor up the ridge that separates the marsh from the river and walked on, back towards the arsenal. As we walked along we were told that under our feet dead men's bones lay closely packed. The ridge could no longer contain a body, and that was the reason why, during the last 5 or 6 years, the lower ground had been taken. Then there is a legend, an old legend, that has passed down to the present time about a little pale blue flower with its purple leaves, the rubrum lamium, which, it is said, grows only over the convict's grave, a flower tender and unobtrusive as the kindness for which the legend gives its credit. Botanists, however, will of course ruthlessly destroy the local faith that has given this flower value, for they will tell you it is only a stunted form of the red dead nettle. We pass from the graves, meeting a perambulating guard who signals "all right" by saluting and raising his hand, and then recrossing the canal bridge where the convicts are stacking wood, and the click and ring of bricklayers' trowels are heard, relieved now and then by the reports of the ordnance rifle practice. We make our way towards the boat, saluted by the "all rights" and salutes of the officers of other working parties that we pass by the way. There are many objects to arrest our attention as we go, from the exploded wrecks of barrels, etc., lying for sale near the butt bank where men are digging shot out of the ground. We meet another patrolling guard who gives the "all right" salute, and whose duty it is, as soon as he hears of an escape, to dash through the enclosure about the arsenal and, waving his carbine horizontally in the air, communicate the fact to the sentries in the marshes. Our way lies then by the rocket sheds, rather celebrated for accidents. "Occasionally you see the men at work there," said the governor, "rush out with their clothes all in flames and dive into the canal. Only a month or so ago 2 or 3 sheds blew up, and the rockets were flying about all amongst my men." As we passed, a workman, black as gunpowder, appeared at the door of one of the sheds with a sieve. Close at hand to the rocket sheds were little powder boats, like miniature Lord Mayor's barges, with the windows blocked up and the gilding taken off. There are the cartridge sheds too, and there the fire engines are always kept at the water's edge in case of accident, and with the hose ready in the water, as you see. "All right, Mr. Watson." "All right, sir. Number 3, 10. Here, opposite the gang of convicts just hailed and who were hard at work stacking planks, were some few idlers upon the top of a barge. "Contrast the conduct of those fellows with my men," was the governor's observation. "Their language is dreadful, as you can hear. You see, too, that new building with the tall minaret chimneys, flanked by low stacks, and with crimson tongues aflame atop. That's a shell factory. There are shoots of white steam and plumes of black smoke issuing from it, and as we advance past endless stacks of heavy timber arranged by the convicts, we hear the rattle of machinery and the noise of wheels. Then as we go by the large new building where mortars are to be cast, the governor approaches a gang and asks again, "All right, Mr. Jennings?" "All right, sir. 10, 10, replies the officer. We now pass through sheds, large as railway stations, under which numerous piles of timber are stacked, together with endless rows of wheelless carts, with their wheels stacked opposite, and here we find the prisoners beginning to march in gangs towards the parade ground. "It is 11:30 o'clock, and they must be on board the hulk to dinner at noon precisely," says the governor to us. As we draw nearer and nearer to the parade ground, we can see them filing along from different directions. There is no confusion on reaching the spot, for each man knows his exact place. Then a strict search of the men is made by the warders to see that they have not secreted anything while at work, the men opening their waistcoats and pulling off their cravats, as before, to facilitate the operation. The searching over, the men descend the stairs, in parties, to the cutters, and return to the hulk in the order in which they left her in the morning, having made the tour of the arsenal, which, including the section of the marshes turned to use, measures 150 square acres in extent. We also returned on board the hulk with the governor. "Way all!" is the word of command, and in a few minutes we are at the defence gangway. The officers are hurrying the convicts on board. "Now, Mr. B, bring your men up." A long boat approaches, crammed with men and warders. "Hoist your oars," cries an officer as the cutter touches the hulk. The warders land first, and then they hurry the men up the gangway steps. As soon as they reach the deck, they advance in single file to their respective hatchways and descend at once to their wards.